Long ago, in the mists that cling to the hills of Ireland, a name was spoken with both wonder and sorrow. John MacNaghten, gambler, lover, outlaw, a man whose legend has outlived even his shame. Standing proud against the mist and time, John became a figure of whispered tales and midnight stories, a soul who fought against the iron hand of fate and lost. But before the name half-hung MacNaghten was etched into history, he was simply John, born to wealth, touched by tragedy, and chased always by the heavy breath of destiny. John MacNaghten entered the world in 1722 into the warm embrace of privilege. His father, Bartholomew MacNaghten, was a merchant of great fortune and a magistrate of Antrim. It seemed that fate had smiled on young John until death came early to their home. Bartholomew's passing left John heir to a vast estate, a heavy burden for a boy barely 6 years old. And so, the boy who should have had everything instead grew up under the long shadow of loss. Educated at Raphoe Royal School and later at Trinity College Dublin, John showed promise, but the glittering temptations of city life soon proved too rich for his blood. Gambling tables whispered to him like sirens, and before long, dice and debts ruled his nights. Within a year, he abandoned his studies, selling off pieces of his estate to feed the hunger he could never satisfy. Yet for every fall, fortune seemed ready to lift him once more. John married Sophie Daniel, daughter of Richard Daniel, the Dean of Down, and with her came a generous dowry that wiped his debts clean. For a while, the promise of love steadied him. They moved to Dublin, and John vowed to leave the gaming halls behind. But vows are easy to make and easier still to break. Before long, the dice called him back. By 1756, John's debts had swollen once more, and a warrant for his arrest was issued. In the chaos of his downfall, tragedy struck. His beloved Sophie, heavily pregnant, died. Some say it was childbirth that took her. Others whisper that it was grief. Grief over her husband's broken promises, his betrayal. John was left hollow, broken, and dangerously reckless. Family friends rushed to his aid, desperate to salvage what remained. Through influence and pity, John was made tax collector for Coleraine, an office that paid well enough for most men, but not for John. Soon he was stealing from the taxes he was meant to protect, and by the time his theft was uncovered, he owed more than £800, a vast sum. The scandal was hushed, the debt repaid by friends, but John MacNaghten was a man already falling faster than anyone could catch. When every door seemed shut to him, one remained open: Prehen House. There, the Knox family offered him sanctuary. Andrew Knox, Member of Parliament for Donegal, welcomed John as a guest, perhaps hoping he could still be redeemed. There, under the misty eaves of Prehen, John met Mary Anne Knox. She was just 18, lively, clever, and beautiful, and to John she seemed like salvation itself. If he could win her hand, he could inherit another fortune, and perhaps at last steady the wreckage of his life. John courted her in secret, whispered conversations in the wild gardens, stolen glances across candlelit dinners. He sought Andrew Knox's permission to marry Mary Anne, but Knox, knowing John's history, refused him outright. Yet John would not be denied. He spun dreams for Mary Anne, convincing her that her father's blessing was merely a formality. In a reckless act of desperation, he staged a mock wedding, a play-acted ceremony beneath the ancient trees of Prehen. Mary Anne agreed, laughing nervously, believing it all a harmless game, but for John it was real. In his heart, he believed Mary Anne to be his wife. Soon after, Knox permitted Mary Anne to travel with family friends to Donegal. Along the way, word reached him of the so-called marriage. Outraged, Knox reclaimed his daughter, forbade John ever to set foot near Prehen again, and sought to sever the bond by any means necessary. John, wounded in pride and heart, followed the family to Sligo. There, in a drunken rage, he challenged a Knox family friend, a man named Love, to a duel. Unsteady on his feet, John barely raised his weapon before he was shot in the leg, humiliated once more before the world. The courts soon ruled against him. The supposed marriage was declared void, and John was ordered to pay heavy damages to the Knox family. Crushed by debt, ruined in reputation, he fled to England, seeking refuge across the sea. But ruin is a faithful hound. In London, John accumulated more debts, failed in politics, and watched his last hopes crumble. And when he heard that Mary Anne had been returned to Ireland, he followed, slipping back into the mist under a false name. In the dark corners of inns and taverns, John wove his final plan. He gathered a band of loyal men, spinning tales of lost love and injustice. He would steal Mary Anne away, he swore, and claim what was rightfully his. The plan was set. Andrew Knox and Mary Anne were to travel south for the opening of Parliament. John would intercept them near Strabane, at a lonely place called Clogher. As mist rolled heavy across the fields, the carriage pulled into Clogher Inn for rest. And as it left, John and his men moved into position, pistols gleaming in the pale morning light. When the coach rounded the bend, John and his men leapt from the mist. Shots cracked through the frozen air. The horses reared. The guards fell back. Inside the carriage, chaos reigned. And then, in a moment that would echo across centuries, Mary Anne Knox threw herself in front of her father. A single shot rang out, and Mary Anne collapsed, blood blooming against her cloak. John, wounded himself, fled into the woods, but the chase was swift. Within hours he was captured, bound in irons, and taken to Lifford Gaol to await judgment. The trial was swift, the evidence overwhelming, the sentence inevitable, death by hanging. But fate was not finished with John MacNaghten. On the day of his execution, a crowd of thousands gathered, some mourning, others jeering. As John stepped onto the scaffold, mist curled around the gallows like a living thing. The noose was placed around his neck, the trapdoor fell, and the rope snapped. For a breathless moment, the world held still. Some cried out to let him go. A sign from heaven, they said. Others demanded the sentence be carried out. Bruised and broken, John could have fled into the arms of the crowd, but he did not. Slowly, painfully, he climbed the scaffold once more. I will not live to be known as half-hung MacNaghten, he said. The second rope held. They buried him behind the old church in Strabane, far from Prehen's misty fields, but some say he never truly left. When the river fog thickens and the hills fall silent, some swear they have seen a lone figure in a battered green coat walking the misted fields near Prehen House, a restless soul still chasing a destiny he could never outrun.